Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here coming to you with a slightly different video. I'm doing some experiments here. If you like this kind of stuff, comment below, like the video, let me know, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. But today we are starting with the first of a series of videos that are going to dissect the evolution of government, government philosophy, and politics. How things have got to the way they are. So starting today, we're going to do government philosophy. Now, what I mean by this is a very important distinction. This isn't the philosophy of people in government. It is the philosophy of governance. In other words, how is the government legitimized? How does it work? Why does it exist? So, to start off here, we pretty much like the most fundamental basic level of governance is more or less informal, not real governance. This occurs in small communities, like maybe about 150 individuals, hunter-gatherer tribes, small, tiny villages kind of stuff, hamlets, that kind of things. This is very informal. It's peer-to-peer. You might have a mayor or someone who's the chief or something, like the de facto leader who makes the final decision on things, but this person is the leader because the consensus of the group has them as the leader. There's no voting, there's no elections, there's no threat of violence making them the leader. They are the leader because everybody knows them and respects them. But they are the first among equals leader. The leader of a small tribe or a tiny village, they are not the dictator, they're not the president. They're just the well-respected man in the community that everyone will listen to, but doesn't necessarily do what they say. So this is the most basic level of governance, and it really is only possible when you have small, tight-knit communities. As soon as you start getting past the point where you know everybody in your community, or at least you know someone in every family in your community, it ceases to function. Once there are strangers, you can't have this. So the inevitable trajectory, if you were to start from the bottom up, or at least the trajectory that our history had, is once you start getting strangers in communities and you have people that no one knows who they are, the first real step forward in governance is more or less the warlord. So now, the warlord is, in a sense, the most fundamental form of government. The idea of the warlord style of governance, the philosophy behind it, isn't that the warlord is a good man, isn't that the warlord is the best leader, isn't that this is the optimal way to govern the society. The warlord's in charge through pure, naked monopoly of violence. The warlord has the weapons, he has soldiers, he will kill you if you contest him. Now, the reason why the warlord is able to maintain this power, even though warlords tend to, and in a lot of senses have to be tyrannical, is because warlords solve the stranger problem. Because the issue with bigger communities, bigger countries, bigger cities, bigger towns, is the strangers. People can't rely on informal methods of security, discipline, etc. If you don't know who people are, people can steal from you. If everyone knows everybody, people will know that you stole Jimmy's bicycle. If you don't know everybody, you can steal Jimmy's bicycle, and you can sell Jimmy's bicycle to someone else, and no one will know. The warlord, the most basic form of actual governments, solves this issue through naked force. People who break the laws or break the rules the warlord sets will be killed, or, at minimum, severely disciplined. So this satisfies the security problem. The people of the warlord's group, of the warlord's area, are secured from strangers and foreigners through naked violence. The thing with warlords, though, is it's the most basic form of government. Everything will go to this point unless will decay to a warlord state, unless more virtuous or more sophisticated methods resist collapse. It is the base layer of governance. Because all that's required for this is pure monopoly of violence. As long as you have monopoly on violence, any state will devolve into effectively a warlord state, given enough time without virtuous leadership who doesn't want to do this. You look at today, you can see examples like the warlords in Somalia, Afghanistan. A lot of the civil wars in Africa are basically just different warlord groups going, but to name two, the civil wars in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the Central African Republic. In Mexico, you kind of see this with the drug gangs, the drug cartels. Those are effectively warlord states in northern Mexico. Well, they're really all over Mexico. But really see that this is basic. If you don't have higher morality, you will get to the state. Now, the next evolution here, this is a very natural evolution, is you go to the warlord monarch. So the warlord monarch is different in that the warlord monarch has enough power in life and enough willpower that they want their kid to succeed them. Or their family member or whatever. They want to pick their successor in life. Now, having a defined and clear successor brings stability to the state, because the problem with warlords is when the warlord dies, you have chaos because there is no clear line of succession. Naturally, you'll have a warlord. The warlord will have a plethora of lieutenants underneath him. And when he dies, these lieutenants will squabble over who should be the next warlord. You can see this with when Alexander the Great died. He was the warlord. When he dies, all of his lieutenants fight over themselves because he didn't have the power and the influence among his lieutenants to get a secure line of succession. The warlord monarch has the secure line of succession. That's the main difference. Now, this increases stability in the life of the warlord because having a secure line of succession means your high-ranking lieutenants, your aristocracy, are not concerned, they're not anxious about what happens when you die. They don't have to worry about jockeying for power, on who's going to come into power after them, if there might be purges afterwards, because typically when a new warlord takes over, there's always purges. And it improves the stability of the state. You mitigate, not remove, mitigate dangerous, devastating succession wars. Now, there's varying degrees of devastating, but they tend to cause a lot of death and damage for really no reason. But the consequence of having a defiant succession is the warlord monarch needs buy-in from the aristocracy. The aristocracy has to feel like they're being represented, that their concerns are being heard, that they're not being completely run in a despotic, tyrannical way. So, in a way, the evolution of the warlord monarchy actually ends true autocracy. A warlord monarch can't be an autocrat. And you kind of see this in some of the classical republics. It's a very similar method. Like, for example, let's say Venice, the Venetian Republic. Yes, it's not a traditional monarchy in that father, son, grandson, great-grandson. But you have a very clear line of succession to the Doge authorship. There's an election among the patricians. Patricians select another one of their own to become the new doge for the rest of their life. That's very similar. It's the same idea. You have a buy-in of the aristocracy, the patricians, and they decide who the next leader is. This is also what elected monarchies are. For example, Poland, Lithuania, or the Holy Roman Empire. That's the kind of deal. This is a more sophisticated type of government, but it's not perfect still. It's not very stable. So the third step in this, and the third step kind of has two sides of a coin here. There's two very similar systems here, but they have very different ideas. And they're both sort of reactions to the warlord monarch. So the first one is the divine monarch. Think Louis XIV, the Emperor of Japan, Emperor of China kind of stuff. So in general, the warlord monarch and the divine monarch are kind of a blurry distinction, but there is a distinction. It's hard to classify a system many monarchs are hard to classify as one or the other, but there are very clear indications of one is a divine monarch and one isn't. Because the main distinction is the divine monarch doesn't claim legitimacy by being the warlord, not through monopoly of violence. The divine monarch typically has a monopoly on violence, but that is not their legitimacy. Their legitimacy is through the grace of God, or in the case of China, heaven, the mandate of heaven kind of stuff. The implication of this is that the divine monarch rules a country, or frequently a nation, as the divine spokesperson for the layperson of the nation. So in a lot of sense, to use language developed 2,500 years, or not 2,500 years, but developed much in the future with Rousseau, the divine monarch is analogous to Rousseau's legislator, and he's supposed to represent the general will of the people, and when he isn't, he's removed by popular revolt. Think Louis XVI, think of what happens when a Chinese emperor has lost the mandate of heaven. In a lot of senses, this is really the return of true autocracy, though, because the aristocracy no longer matters, and the layperson, the plebeian, they matter, but their voice is already considered to be expressed by the monarch. The monarch does not need to consult them, the monarch is them. The similar system that has emerged as a reaction of the warlord monarchs and the warlords is the proto-Rousseauian republic. Now, these are direct reaction to tyranny. Think ancient Athens, classical Rome, stuff like that, Carthage. So the main feature of the proto-Rousseauian republic is that it's a quasi-total democracy. Almost everything that can be voted on should be voted on, and anyone in power should be in power for as little as possible and have as frequent consultations to the demos, the people, as possible. Think the Roman consulship. 1-year term, there's 2 consuls, they share it half, 50-50. Effectively, everything that can be voted on is voted on, and the state derives its legitimacy effectively by representing the general will, to use Rousseauian terms again, which is why I'm calling this the proto-Rousseauian republic. This is my terminology. But in the sense of the proto-Rousseauian republic, the general will is being represented by pure majoritarian rule, with the belief that, since people are rational, the majority is always rational and correct. Give some more specific examples. Even in situations where these republics start decaying and start getting in really quasi-warlord or quasi-monarchical territories, such as when Caesar effectively became dictator of Rome, the legitimacy is still because that Caesar styled himself as a representative of the people of Rome. He represented their issues, their concerns. His legitimacy was from the people. And this is a very big distinction towards warlords, either flavor. The legitimacy of Caesar wasn't because he was the biggest, baddest. His legitimacy was he represented the people of Rome's interest. So, both the divine monarch and the proto-Rousseauian republic are actually very similar, and they sort of overlap. You see a lot of the Italian city-states and other republics that have popped up in Europe, for example, are before Rousseau, naturally, are the proto-Rousseauian republics types. And they often coexist with the divine monarchs like Louis XIV. They're not always. Now, the fourth step here is where we really start getting a big departure, because these other four systems, you can find examples of them that have existed forever. For example, a really old system of the divine monarch is more or less ancient Egypt. The pharaoh is the divine monarch. He is, I believe, supposed to be, the pharaoh are supposed to be gods, or God on earth, or whatever. I'm not an expert on ancient Egypt, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments there. So, the fourth step is a bunch of things that evolved in the 18th century, more or less, because of the Enlightenment thinkers, and subsequent revolutions that occurred there. The first one is, again, it's kind of a blurry line here, but it's the Enlightened monarch. This is very blurry to the divine monarch, because they're very similar, but the rationale and the explanation is different. The divine monarch is legitimate by God's grace. The enlightened monarch is legitimate because they are the father of the nation. In a lot of senses, the enlightened monarch is a development that coexisted or co-evolved with nationalism. They heavily intertwine, and it's kind of hard to remove them. And a lot of historical examples, for example, in Europe of nationalism, are very heavily intertwined with the monarch. Or, in a lot of senses, a quasi-monarchical figure. For example, Ataturk in Turkey, he's not actually a monarch, but he's quasi in that position while he was effectively dictator of Turkey, or president, if you will. The enlightened monarch is generally strongly into state paternalism. The rationale is they're the father of the nation, they're father of the country. The subjects are their children, and they are doing the best interest of their kids to make them better. That's really the rationale, and you see this pop up pretty much most of the monarchies in Europe by the 1900s. Russia, Prussia, Austria, France, they all kind of adopted this model. And at this point, pretty much every monarchy styles itself in this way. When the monarch is ruling for the betterment of their people, that is their legitimacy. That's pretty much how every single monarch has evolved. So now we have the next one, which also evolves similar time. This is coming out of the Rousseau's The Social Contract, which is the Post-Rousseauian republic. Now, this differs from the proto-Rousseauian republic in that, well, Rousseau has written books now. Rousseau, you have to keep in mind here, is kind of a descriptive and a prescriptive author, and his descriptive authorship kind of just more or less outlines what the proto-Rousseauian republic is. But the post-Rousseauian one is following his proscriptive ideas. So in the proto-Rousseauian republic, you have the government, which is separate from the people, the sovereign, which is legislates through the general will, and the government is enlightened individuals who implement the general will for the citizens. And this is affirmatively confirmed, or there's affirmative consent through voting. The entire legitimacy here is that these people in government are representing the general will. If they are not, they have to be removed. And this plays out quite spectacularly in the French Revolution, with all the coups, counter coups, counter coups. It's hilarious, actually, if you read about it. But really, the only true post-Rousseauian republic kind of dies at the Thermidorian reaction, so it lasts about 5 years in France. Not even 5 years, more like 3. Since then, you have republics that are styled like that or are very similar to that, but they don't follow all of Rousseau's prescriptive requirements. But I would still classify them as a post-Rousseauian republic because their legitimacy or their claim to legitimacy is styled exactly as Rousseau describes it. You see this quite a lot in modern states. Most left-wing parties subscribe to this. The other development here in the 18th century, which really contrasts the post-Rousseauian republic, is American republicanism. American republicanism differs quite strongly in that it completely rejects the idea of the general will, or that people as a whole will always agree on the best course of action. As well described in the Federalist Papers by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, the American republicanism is based on the idea that society is broken up into different factions that are based on their own interests, and that there is no clear, obvious general interest of society, and you can never know any general interest. And the way to structure and run a government is effectively like treating politics as team sports. These different factions are fighting for power, and the system has to be set up in such a way that these factions are very clearly, very blatantly, and very openly fighting for power with each other, and that the most virtuous and the most persuasive arguments will win. But this system has to be designed and implemented such that the American Republic will stagnate, or I'll rephrase this, will gridlock. Gridlock is the goal and the idea, because gridlock should only be broken when there's such a societal consensus on something, it happens. But if there is no societal consensus, nothing should happen. It should be frozen in place. And in the case of the US, the Republicans support American republicanism, and the Democrats are post-Rousseauian republicanism incarnate. They pretty much subscribe to all the attributes of Rousseau. And that's where the big divide in the US is. There's specific policy issues here and there, but the philosophical divide on how government should be run is there. And if you want more thoughts on Rousseau, I could dissect Rousseau specifically in another video, but it will be outside of scope for this. And now we get to stage 5 here. So stage 5 is really the last stage we have to date. And this is where we start getting a bunch of hybridization of these previous systems. So the main hybrid form we kind of have now, you see in Sweden, Norway, UK, Canada, etc., is a hybrid of the post-Rousseauian republic and the Enlightened monarchy. The monarch is legitimized as ruling for the people, and the democracy is supposed to be as encompassing and as total as possible because it's representing the general will of the people. You see this very clearly in Westminster-style parliaments, where effectively they operate under the philosophy of parliamentary supremacy, and there is very little checks and balances. And the executive, combined with the legislature, are almost indistinguishable, and it rules totally. Now, some of these systems have bolted on Supreme Courts that can veto laws, and then you start getting into a really weird system that doesn't really make coherent sense. But overall, they generally follow this methodology. Now, the main new development, and this is really an evolution. This is taking the post-Rousseauian republic to its logical conclusion. The paternalist Rousseauian dictatorship. So the paternalist Rousseauian dictatorship is effectively what happened when you took Rousseau, you took his logical conclusions from reading his work. Then you add scholars like Marx, Giovanni Gentili, Engels, etc. You add their influence onto this. And that's when you get this. So, in essence, the dictator is Rousseau's legislature, and he's chosen by the elite of the party to implement the general will. And the general will is described aptly, depending on who you subscribe to, by either Marx or Gentili, and effectively a communistic or fascistic dictatorship. And the dictator rules as quasi-absolute power, and he acts, generally speaking, as a father figure to the nation. Look at how Hitler was treated. Look at how Stalin was treated. Look at how even Xi Jinping is generally treated in China, USSR, and Nazi Germany collectively. You could, I think, reasonably also argue that this really should be called national divinity, but I'm coining the terms, so I ain't calling the terms here. In this regard, especially in the case of Nazi Germany, where this is very clear, the dictator is essentially the divine embodiment of the nation, especially if you look at how all the culty, anti-mainstream religion things that Hitler was partaking in, and Himmler specifically. So you really see this as the final evolution, to date at least, of Rousseau combined with a bunch of other later scholars here. And here we kind of have all of the government structures that more or less exist here. Now, I haven't exhausted every government that's ever existed or whatever, but these are the main philosophies, and pretty much any government you can name falls into one of these. Or some hybridized version of them, like parliamentary democracies today. Now with that, I will end the video here. If you liked it, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below if you think this is an interesting style of video. If it's dumb, I don't know. If you prefer other stuff, let me know. And I will keep targeting things. This is a newer subject, but I don't really have much else to do right now. Not a lot of polls, so let me know in the comments. And with that, I bid you adieu.